welcome to Café CLIL, and today we've got on an esteemed guest, Patrick De Boer from the Netherlands. I hope I pronounced that properly. Patrick's easy, De Boer's more difficult, who is well known in CLIL circles internationally and in the Netherlands as well, and mainly I think for his mainly but not exclusively for his work in the on the CLIL media website, which is still live. He doesn't curate it now because he's got thousands of children, but he's gone back to working full time, which is also good. I think as a CLILer to go back to the classroom. I'm a bit too old for that now, but Patrick isn't. And his website, I do recommend it, CLIL Media, is excellent. Got some fantastic podcasts. You've got lots of people on there. You've got lots of ideas on there. Great resource, really worth looking at. But we're talking to Patrick today because really he's a mathematician. And we're going to talk a little bit about that subject-specific aspect of CLIL with him. It's particularly interesting to sort of to interview him for that. Hello, Patrick. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Correct. There, I only got 3 kids, by the way, not 1,000.
No, sorry. Yeah,
But they're a handful. I agree.
yeah, yeah. No. Thank you for coming on as well, because I know your time's limited. Not like lazy retirees like me, but yeah, you've got to structure your day. I do remember that. But anyway, we're talking about maths in CLIL mainly, and your experience in that. So I think you should really do the talking, and I think that the first question is really. How did you get into doing maths in CLIL? Obviously, you're a maths teacher, but that was a decision to make. I think, particularly 15 years ago when you started doing that, when maths maybe wasn't so common in CLIL. I mean, maybe it's not so common even now. Was that a personal decision or institutional decision, or was it both?
No, it was a personal one. When I went to secondary education, the school that I went to was one of the first schools that offered bilingual education, which is later what they would implement CLIL in. So I was taught in English in a lot of subjects, and there was only about 10 secondary schools in the Netherlands offering that. And by the time I graduated, there were about more than 100, and over time we grew to about 130 bilingual schools in the Netherlands, all offering CLIL, all offering most of the subjects in English. I was not taught maths in English. Back then it wasn't a thing yet, but by the time I graduated, and I also got my maths teacher diploma, by then maths was a bilingual subject as well. So when I returned to my old school as a teacher, maths was being taught in English, and because I had done my bilingual education, well, it wasn't that much of a stretch to start teaching that in English as well, and I became the bilingual math teacher at school. And I quickly know, when they started with bilingual education in the Netherlands, the focus was primarily on English. So it was just, if you can speak English, you can teach bilingual education. And after a while, they realized that's not quite how it works. You need some didactical changes in your the procedures change, the way you teach changes, and that's when CLIL was introduced. So that was really new to me because I was never taught about that. And I started diving into that and starting doing courses on that. And before I knew it, I was CLIL coach within my school and started helping out others with that. So that's when I started combining CLIL and maths. And obviously, a lot of resources back then were all about history and geography and biology, the language-heavy subjects, because they are easier to implement CLIL to for some reason. So I started to develop things for maths because they were not around that much. And I had to teach in English anyway, so I had to develop stuff myself. And that's how it kind of got out of hand. And a couple of years later, I was a CLIL trainer. Yeah.
It's interesting because, I mean, for people listening as well, I think who'd be considering this, I mean, you talk about bilingual system, obviously there are bilingual systems and bilingual systems. There are differences in bilingual systems all over Europe even. But I mean that you were teaching maths in secondary, let's just be specific here. So that's in the Netherlands, that's from 12. So kids coming through primary would have been doing their numeracy and their basic mathematics in Dutch, and then they moved to English. I mean, was that a challenge?
That is a challenge, because they come in and they already have quite a they know a lot of things already. They can do arithmetics in Dutch, And then they enter my classroom, and I start explaining to them, well, it's nice that you say it like that, but I want you to say it in English. So instead of teaching them something new, I need to relearn, reteach, some things, and that can be a challenge. By the way, we do, once they enter from primary, we kind of assume they can't do anything in English. So we build it up gradually. It's not like we just start speaking English right from the start and make them cry. We do, well, gradually, we generally have the rule until autumn break, which is about 2 months in. Teachers and students are allowed to speak Dutch here every now and then. Between autumn and Christmas, the teachers start speaking English only, but the students are still allowed to speak Dutch. And after Christmas, it's English only. And I've done this for, well, more than 15 years. And generally speaking, students can do that. I'm always amazed by how quickly they pick that up. So that's maybe good as a reference there, that you know a bit about what, because they get taught so many subjects in English, about 75% of their subjects are taught in English.
Yeah.
They pick it up really quickly. But then that's the general English, and you also need the math-specific, subject-specific language, which is often quite scientific. In my case, we have books of the Dutch curriculum which have been translated into English, not very clearly. It's just a one-on-one translation, which requires the teachers to implement scaffolding and focus on language a lot more. Students know in primary school that, you know, the plus sign is plus, and luckily in English it's the same. But in Dutch, vierhoek in English would be a quadrilateral, which is completely different. So a really simple concept all of a sudden becomes a very difficult new English word, which is almost academic to them. So that's where you have to keep an eye on when you teach maths, and that's why there's a lot of language, in my opinion, in maths as well. And the other reason I think there's a lot of language as well is because whenever I ask students to complete an assignment, of course they write down numbers. But whenever I do an opening question or a check for understanding or a lesson recap, I want them to explain their thought process, and that's in English. So they still need the language output there to make sure that something is happening language-wise and math-wise.
Well, you're moving naturally onto the sort of second
Right.
question, aren't you? But I mean, there
Yeah.
is, but just before we get onto that, because you have hinted what you think there. I mean, there is this general impression, I think, in most of Europe that, you know, the Dutch or in the Netherlands in general, English is generally spoken, generally understood, and well spoken and well understood, which is true, I think, in most people's experience. But obviously, as you were hinting there, there's a difference between speaking English well and perhaps the academic aspect of English. So when those primary kids come through, the fact that they'll probably be speaking good English and have heard a lot of it in the Netherlands doesn't necessarily help them in maths, does it?
No. And I would even say that it's not necessarily the case that they know already a lot of English when they come from primary school. There's not by the end of secondary, all students need to do centralized exams. So then we've got fixed learning objectives by the end of secondary. We do have those for primary as well, but not when it comes to English. So we've got kids coming in who have been at primary bilingual schools, and I've got kids coming in who know yes, no, and a few bad words. So and everything in between. So I assume they know nothing from the start, and we build from there. And that's also where the English language teacher plays a vital role, because they obviously have to focus on the basics of English. And that's why they get taught more English lessons in bilingual education than they do in regular. But I need to focus on the academic stuff or the math subject specific stuff and the process stuff and classroom English, you know, the standard things. Can I go to the bathroom? Those kind of things they also need to be taught, because they also can only do that in Dutch. So there's a lot of things they can already do, but we need to, well, teach them how to do that in English.
Well, yeah, well, one of the yes, of course. I mean, the big scalp thing, but I mean, the one of the um, let's say one of the aspects where people doubt mathematics in CLIL is because they say that the language is so formulaic, which it is, that it's not kind of rich enough or something. It doesn't. Why do maths? Why do maths in a second language when you could do it in the first language? Because you're not really getting enough peripheral language, let's say, or you're not. Maybe the academic language itself doesn't take you far enough. I mean, what's your view of that? You obviously disagree. You obviously don't agree with that. Neither do I. But that's what the doubters say.
Yeah, you know, I get, as what I just said about the primary things of CLIL were first about history and geography, and the language heavy subjects. And I get that. If you have a piece of text that you can work with, if you can get text and all those kind of things, they work wonders with. You need texts, and you don't have those at maths, or at least, you can have an instruction that's somewhat longer, but mostly it's calculations. So I get, from that perspective, I understand what people might mean with there's less language around. But when you go to a classroom of maths and you listen to what the students are doing and you listen to the instruction and what I can do with language, there really isn't less language. It's just written down less. But that means I focus more on spoken output, or I focus more on procedural language, which means that I don't just want an answer. I might not even want a calculation. I want them to write down the step-by-step process in words on what they do, so I can check if they understand what they're doing and also give some feedback on language. So it changes the way that I teach a bit. But interestingly, and that's something I hear back a lot from other teachers, is when they start implementing CLIL in their English language, in their English lessons, they start changing the lessons they might teach in Dutch as well. Because, non-bilingual students also like scaffolding and also like focus on language. So it's actually not like CLIL is bilingual teaching only. It actually is a way of teaching that works in both non-bilingual and bilingual lessons. Because there's a lot of language around as well. CLIL, I know in America, is also used for students for whom English is a second language, because they don't speak English at home. And we've got students for whom that applies as well, where English might be the third language or the fourth. So there's always language around. You can't communicate without language. And what I do is I try to filter out the ones that I want to put emphasis on. And there's so much I can do. One of my favorite activity is the alphabet activity, where I just say, well, make list the alphabet, and you get a minute to write down as many words as you can for different starting letters, just to get about a certain topic. And it just makes them aware of how much language they already know and how many words related to the subjects they need to understand me. And this I can do 2 months in already, and they will be able to complete almost the entire alphabet.
Is it in a sense, is it the precision of mathematical academic language that attracts you to the CLIL? I mean, we've been talking, Keith and I have been talking about the Wisconsin people, the Weeder people, and their mathematical description in terms of cognitive discourse functions is just 4. They talk about narrate, inform, explain, and argue, and that's super clear for me. If I've got narrate, inform, explain, argue, I can understand that in terms of the mathematics curriculum. I think I know what that would break down into. I mean, is that also what attracted you to it? There are limitations obviously to the academic, but what I mean is that it's very observable in mathematics, isn't it? The mathematics is very identifiable.
Yeah, it is.
The language.
And what I really like about maths, and also the way that it's. No, let me start with your question. I didn't know this publication before you sent it to me, so I can't say, well, I do it like that because I didn't know it. But I get the way they categorize things, and just like you said, if I see those topics, I can immediately come up with examples and ideas that would fit those 4 categories. So I think it's a great way to categorize things and to formalize it, if you will. I'm afraid I'm not that much into really structuring everything. I just do what I think works. And generally speaking, I got a lot of things going on that work. I think one of the reasons I also started doing, the website and everything, what you mentioned in the intro, is because I wanted to organize, or attempt to organize, all of my thoughts and ideas into some kind of system. So I have all those activities and ideas somewhere that people can benefit from. But I'm afraid I didn't go into teaching maths like that because I really liked that organization. I do like maths because it's really structured and you build upon prior knowledge, and that's why activating prior knowledge is so essential in every lesson. Because if you teach geography and you talk about volcanoes, and next up, and I'm generalizing a lot here, but you get the idea. Next up you talk about earthquakes, or next up you talk about something complex. You don't necessarily need the language from the prior thing, but if you can't do a calculation properly, we can't move on to solving formulas, right? So there is a gradual build-up there, and that's something I really like about maths. And the added dimension, and maybe also the added difficulty there with CLIL, is that once I got a student who's not able to do something, I need to not only filter where in the prior knowledge mathematically seen is this going wrong, but it might also be a language component that they just don't understand the question or are not able to explain their thought process properly. So on one hand, it might make it a bit more challenging. On the other hand, I think it gives me more ways of explaining things because I can explain something 3, 4, 5 different ways in English. And if a student still doesn't understand it, I can always go back to Dutch, as a fail-safe. So that, I think it helps me as a teacher to be a more complete teacher and have even more a wider variety of tools at my disposal to help students out.
I'm really glad you said that because, the only thing we haven't touched on, we'll have to finish in a moment, but I mean, the only thing we haven't touched on really is this thing that's called, fear of maths. There's this sort of maths phobia thing that does exist, I suppose, in the world. And I was one of those who had that maths phobia, and I wasn't very good at it at school. But since I've become, an adult, I've reflected on that and thought, if I went back now, would I be better at it? But I have also honestly thought, Patrick, that if I went back and did maths in a second or a third language, I would do it better because I would be more aware of the language. Is that fair enough? I really have had that thought. I'd like to go back and try again, but I do it in a different language because of what you say, because the language is more salient.
Actually, I refer to that word a lot whenever I talk about CLIL and math, salient. Make them aware. Make students aware of the language. And I do that a lot. We're not just focusing on new words that they learn, but also, can you describe this thought process, making them aware of the language component, making them aware that they need to be able to explain what they think in a second language, and of course also in the first language. But I think whenever you teach in a second language, you automatically focus more on that second language, and you focus more on the language part of the process. And I think that's crucial. And I think a lot of non-bilingual teachers can do that as well, but might be just a bit more reluctant because they speak Dutch, so why bother focus on language? Whereas it makes more sense to focus on language when you teach in a second language. I actually had a course where I would do exactly the same things that I do in English, but then completely translated in Dutch and to teachers who would not be teaching bilingual education, like CLIL, and I would get a lot of resistance because teachers were like, we need to change things, or we already do language, so why bother doing this? And I was like, oh, this is so different from the teachers I train in bilingual education, because there they go, well, I need to teach in a second language, so obviously I need to change something. So it's interesting that it's almost a different mindset, and when you teach in a different language, that that something needs to change in the way you teach, so you're more open-minded to new stuff. I'm not saying that teachers are always like that, but it's just generally what I noticed, and I think that helps for teachers to be aware of the language aspect of their lesson, which is, well, always around, I guess.
So, I mean, to conclude, you would basically say, obviously, it's implicit in what you're saying now, but you would say, don't be afraid of doing maths in a second or a third language. There are lots of benefits to be accrued, let's say.
And I would agreed, yes. And added to that, I've done it for 15 years and I've never seen a student fail. So I'm quite positive that it's possible. I'm not saying students are always best at maths, but language, the CLIL aspect was never the reason to not be able to not succeed at maths. Obviously, there are students who are good at maths and others who are less good, but it's never the language component.
Thank you. Brilliant, Patrick. I'll stop it there.
Great. So I decided to go with dog this morning, Phil. What about you?
Oh,
you forgot your coffee.
I was about to swear there. I just had my coffee and I went for some water.
Okay, sure.
Is that all right? I don't want to break
We've
the
taken
tradition.
in another dog. We've got another dog because the lady who adopted this street dog we took in is having a procedure in hospital. So her dog's having a holiday at our house for the time.
Right.
I went with the dog mug. Listen, Patrick's enthusiasm is just palpable, isn't it? He's so positive about teaching maths through English.
Yeah, he's a glass half full, but he's a full glass person, isn't he? I mean, it's all those. He doesn't even bother with the arguments against. Well, there are arguments. I think the arguments have dissipated over the years, because it's a prestige subject. You know, I
Yeah,
did
yeah.
mention that in the conversation, but yeah, he's
It's
absolutely
very, very positive.
he just bats it all out the way, doesn't he? And says,
Yeah.
"Look,
I
I
mean,
do this, I do this,
you
I do
do
this."
raise the question of fear, a fear of maths. And I have to say that if it's not a fear, it's a protectionism of maths as a subject. And certainly in Bulgaria, it's very rare to find anybody teaching maths through English as a foreign language.
Yeah, same in Spain. I mean, I think Patrick was talking about bilingual schools. I think in bilingual schools you might find it. I mean, IGCSE or cater for that as well. You know,
Sure, sure.
I suppose there is that. There are pockets of that, but yeah, in general, it's what's called a prestige subject, and so
Yeah, yeah.
it hasn't strayed so far into the world of CLIL as, you know, social
No,
science, for
no, no.
example, or
I mean,
straight science.
our subtitle was steer clear or dive in. I mean, and my take is dive in. And the reason I think dive in is because it is so specific. There's very little redundant language in maths. You know, it's all associated with a quite abstract curriculum.
Yeah.
And, you know, there may be discussion, there may be group discussion work, but the curriculum itself is very precise and the language is very specific. And I think that's an advantage when working through delivering the curriculum in a foreign language.
Totally, totally, and again, it's Patrick uses the phrase. He talks about other things as being, you know, language heavy subjects. It's interesting he says that,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
of course, maths. I suppose you could argue that maths is language heavy in a different way. I think that it's very formulaic. That was the word I used. It's also
yeah,
very
yeah,
it's quite dense in a different way, isn't it? You know, a mathematics operational sentence will be
yeah, yeah,
absolutely 100% PowerPoint, 100% academic, and
yeah.
you don't often get that, do you? You don't often get that in
No,
subjects, maybe in certain aspects of science,
no.
but
Maybe
yeah, it's
perhaps
very precise.
when you meet the Austrian vocational school teachers who teach about concrete strength, for example, maybe that gets very specific. But maths as a subject generally, compared to Patrick Meshan's social science subjects, is very specific, and I think it's an advantage. One of the things I think it's an advantage for is that we know how the young learner brain develops conceptually when we look at maths and science concepts, and there are studies done. I wanted to mention the Linton Charlesworth study from, it's a British American study that led to a publication, and I'll put in the notes the publication, because it outlines 16 foundational skills for early years maths and science progression, and I think that progression probably continues. I say probably because I haven't had a look at how it grows through secondary and upper secondary. But I think that's what Patrick was looking at when he said his kids come with fairly fluent English. And what he does is scaffold the language they need for maths onto their conversationally fluent English when they come to him.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the old big scalp dance now. Yeah, I mean the Netherlands. Everybody knows. I think there's a high level of let's say, you know, normal English in at street
Yeah,
level, and
yeah,
I think
yeah,
even when the kids get to secondary, but he says there is that absence of
yeah,
academic language. Very interesting that example he gave now of was it the quadrilateral? You know, if you said if you say the word quadrilateral to a Spanish speaker, they'll go,
yeah,
yeah, it's exactly the same, more or less, no? But
yeah,
it was a Weerhoek, no, something.
yeah,
I was
yeah,
quite surprised by that.
yeah.
It's quite interesting information that, you know,
It would be interesting to have a look at a map, wouldn't it, of
yeah,
that word around Europe and see what the different forms are. In Bulgarian, it's pravougdelen. It means, so it doesn't have anything in common with Latin or Old German. It doesn't have anything in common.
no, that's right. It's drawing on its own language family, and it's interesting. But again, you know, I don't, you know, there's arguments pro and con that just because in a Spanish or a French or Italian student would recognize that word doesn't
Yeah.
mean it makes it any easier for them.
No, no.
Sometimes it's the distance between those two items that often makes it more
Yeah,
memorable, you know. So
yeah, yeah,
it's not
yeah.
necessarily a problem.
I mean, in terms of approach, Patrick touches on originally in Holland. He said if you could speak English, it was expected that you could teach through English. And he talks about, of course, that's not the case. You need a method, you need an approach to working bilingually even with the Dutch children who have very fluent conversational English.
Yeah.
And that brings me to the idea of he probably predicts what language his students need, knowing their level very well, and then accommodates that within his sequential maths lessons. In some situations, teachers are not aware of the language demands of their subjects, and I've been very privileged to sit in and observe and transcribe lessons, and there are two contexts I'm going to share. One is the International School of Belgrade, where I got to sit in on maths lessons, transcribe, and then kind of analyze what language was being used and make suggestions to teachers. And I'll put that in the link. And the other is a book we made for the Lithuanian Ministry of Education and the British Council. Again, I was visiting primary and secondary maths lessons, transcribing what the teacher language is and what the student language is, and making suggestions about what to do later, what other ideas and what other resources could go well with that language maths context. And I think Patrick's probably one of the best equipped people around, because he's fluent in English, he's a maths teacher, and he's got very able students to work with.
Yeah. I'm very interested by that, what he said there. I mean, I'd sort of thought about it before, but he put it in a very interesting way, that the structural logic and progressive logic of mathematics is actually an advantage in terms of language, because he said that, if I detect that a student has missed something in a process, in a sequence, as you say, then I can go back and I can supply the language, and I can even identify what the problem is. Is it a conceptual or is it a language problem? Is it, and so all this business about maths being a problem because it's the cognitive load argument, isn't it? They've got enough with processing the concepts, and if they don't have the language, but actually Patrick just bats that away, doesn't he?
I think so. The quote he used, the words he uses, I wrote it down because I was taken with it as well, Phil. He says, it's really structured because it works on prior knowledge. And I agree 100% with that. You find, I mean, my experience mainly is within very early years maths, which we do in my school. And so I've got a lovely image of one of our children counting in sets. And that they can only do that at a certain age, because prior to that moment where they get the idea of counting in sixes, for example, it's very individual sequential counting. And prior to that, it's symbols with number matching, and that simple explanation of those three steps, I think, probably works its way through all the maths curriculum. And if it does, then it's only a short step to scaffolding all the language around it that's needed.
Well, that's right. Again, he just mentioned that also the semiotics of maths are universal as well. That's interesting as a symbolic language. In Bulgarian and in Bulgarian and English, it is the same. So you do have that. That's layered above the supposed linguistic problem, isn't it? So you're always working towards that. Less than, more than. I mean, all that stuff is. It is exactly the same. I mean, we do mention Ouida as well, the Ouida stuff, and again, if you look at what they do in maths, they look at three things. They look at organization of language, they look at cohesion, and they look at density. So if you look at organization, cohesion, and density in terms of what Patrick was saying, you can just say, well, maths is a great idea to do in a second language, because you've got the organization. We've already said that. You've got the cohesion, and the cohesive devices in mathematics are very, very clear in the sentential structure.
And he also said something about you need texts. We don't have many texts in maths, he says. But we can create word problems. And when thinking through a word problem, that demands language. So he was talking about getting his students, I imagine, because he never mentioned building a thinking curriculum, but I've had conversations with Patrick about this and heard him talk about a thinking curriculum before. And largely that's based around small groups talking to each other about what they've been asked to do. And I think that's the case here, when you're given a word problem, you talk through it with your peers, and then you begin to develop the ideas of what the maths language is for working through solving that word problem in formulaic terms. And I've got an example from the Lithuania publication. I'll pop that in exactly in this context. He's spot on.
He's spot on. Although I'm not saying he's wrong or right. I mean, he's right. But there's another aspect of, he uses the word text in a quite conventional sense now, and I would argue also that mathematical text is also the graphics of mathematics. So you've got a lot of mathematics is very visual. That's what the problem in maths for me when I was a kid was actually transferring the visual into the verbal, or into the written. I mean, there's that gap, So mathematical text, as it were, is a broader term than say historical text. So I'm not correcting him there. I'm just extending.
No, I think you're absolutely right to raise that point. Temple Grandin, the visual thinkers, autistic professor of animal science, says exactly the same thing, that she couldn't cope with algebra because it was so symbolic. Luckily, she had parents who were able to sit down and verbalize. So, story form what those symbols mean, and that allowed her to access the language and concepts behind the symbols. And I think that's what CLIL does. We verbalize symbols, and I think in a way that I'm putting it out there, aren't I? And I do that. I've got a big mouth, but in a way that may not happen in regular run-of-the-mill classrooms.
Well, that's the other thing, isn't it? We haven't got long because, but the other thing is, where the language teachers fit into all this, I mean, there is I don't want to be patronizing because I've come through a different route, and I've very rarely found any language teachers who have ever said to me, Keith, hey, I was going to be an applied maths teacher, but I decided to teach language. And you don't find many. You do find a lot of hard CLIL teachers doing maths. I've got two teachers on the online course now who teach maths in Kazakhstan, through English. So you do find
where are they based?
In Kazakhstan, they're teaching maths and English, but they're hard CLIL teachers. What I mean is that there's the fear of maths is probably something which does resonate with language teachers in general. Maybe it's just I think there's a kind of surface incompatibility between this language and maths thing, and that's why it's happened. But I think that again, in soft CLIL there are ways of getting around that. We were talking about in the last podcast we were talking about life between buildings that we'd done in the English curriculum. And of course,
absolutely,
what the kids do is they have to find that urban space, defective urban space, and they have to propose how they're going to make it better. Well, they have to describe the space and show it graphically. But we require them to talk in mathematical terms first of all about the space. So whatever they say. So what did they say? Well, our space that we're is going to be, it'll have these dimensions. They have to talk about diameter, circumference. They've got to use quite exact language, square meters, And it's no big deal in mathematical terms, but there's no reason why you can't do that in English. And
I think there's a wonderful colleague in Cyprus, Maria Shirley, who attended one of my courses, and she said something I will never forget, because she's a maths teacher but works in preschool and also consults with the Ministry of Education. But her thing that struck me was she said, let's math the curriculum. And what she was meaning by that was make everything maths and then develop all the rest from the maths.
That's interesting.
Vertebra, if you like.
Right.
The backbone is maths, and then stick everything else on it. And it's a very wonderful way of thinking about learning, isn't it? Why not? Why not do everything through math or maths?
Well, the other thing, I don't want to pick up on everything we said, but I did mean that thing I said at the end. I mean, I won't do it because I haven't got time, but I do mean that I wasn't very good at maths at school, but I feel now, I didn't say it spontaneously to Patrick, I do feel that if I went back to try and do maths again, I would do it in Spanish. Which is
I agree entirely.
Because of the salience of the language. I know that the language will be more salient to me, and if a teacher like Patrick is making it salient, I'm going to get it.
You know, maybe an idea for one of our podcasts, Phil, is we get somebody with a language neither of us knows and a subject, and we spend 30 minutes trying to learn something from that subject and that language.
Okay, yeah, I'll go for that.
Listen, we only gave ourselves 10 minutes and we've run over slightly, but let's stop there. I think that's a good point to stop.